The panel today is about contestations, and all my panelists have long-standing practices in dealing with these issues from the ground up. The detailed CVs are in the book which everybody has, the booklet everybody has. And I will just straight dive into the panels. My first speaker is Kachi Kohli. Just very briefly, Kanchi works for the Center for Policy Research. I've known Kanchi for several years as a young activist who has been in detail following processes from the ground of environmental clearances, of environmental impact assessments, and how some of these projects come about. Kanchi.
Thank you, Ravi. Thank you for getting me here. It's been splendid the last day and a half to just take in all that is happening, and just having that as a background in terms of how difficult, and especially yesterday's session, which spoke about chaos, almost lent me into thinking of why all the conflicts actually arise, because chaos could lead to conflict, and conflicts are not, and contestations are not always necessarily negative. They have all kinds of outcomes. So what I'll try and do is just in the next 10-15 minutes just share with you a few observations, and I'll start with a story which is basically about who came first. So all of us have many of us have seen Jungle Book, the film, read the book, and this is Jungle Book land in India, parts of central India, which has Bagheera, Mowgli, all of them in real life, all out there. These forests are called the Hasdeoran Forests of central India. Hasdeo is a river, Aranya is forest, and it is also interspersed with very different kinds of people, both extracting from the place and living in the space. And why I say who came first is about just a couple of years back, we were in the forest of Hasdeoran, and we saw these elephants who were tied up, and they were really angry. And the people who were tending to them were the people who are from the forest department. And they were tending to the elephants, and I mean, they were chained, they were bruised, they were extremely angry, and we were wondering what was happening. I mean, forest department usually doesn't chain elephants. I mean, it's violation of law to actually have wild elephants chained. What was really happening? So basically, these elephants had strayed into a village. The village was supposed to be relocated from a tiger reserve, and the elephants were torched because they had moved into the village. The village, in order to protect their homes, their fields, had actually gone after the elephants, extremely angry in Jungle Book land. And the forest department had actually rescued the elephants and taken care of them. About a few hundred kilometers away was the town of Bilaspur, which has a lot of wildlife conservationists there. And they actually slapped a case against the forest department officials that because they actually had the wild elephants captive. And actually the root of trying to understand these conflicts is, these are the villages of the area, is something like this. Why have many of these elephants, which would otherwise probably have their corridors, really traverse into these villages and have this conflict gets heightened? The conflicts have always existed, but the conflicts get heightened. And that's because Hasdeoran actually is gradually really opening up for coal mining. And most of the elephant corridors have been either fractured, destroyed, etc. So this is what happens there. And it's not that the elephants are only in, traversing through those villages. Even fragmented habitats which have got railway lines for this coal mine, this railway line is for this coal mine, they're now entering and struggling. So the struggle is for the Adivasi that we're talking about, the struggle is for the elephants, and the miners who really want to open up that earth are also going to be in conflict, because these are not going to be issues that are going to be disregard conservationists or rights-based activists, etc. But the crucial issue here is about who came first. And this forest actually has, we have the legislation of the Forest Rights Act. This forest, has a claim by the community there under the Forest Rights Act, or the Community Forest Rights Claim, where they've got large tracts of the forest which they want to conserve, and they've got the legal right for it. Around the same time this whole thing was happening, the local government decided to revoke the community forest rights, saying actually your community forest rights is coming in the way of mining. Now the big struggle there is, were the elephants there first? Were the people there first? Or was the mine there first? And in many ways, the challenge for environment regulation in the 1980s world over, when environment regulation was first brought in, the challenge for environment regulation is actually to take good decisions. How do you decide? How do you prioritize? And those are the choices governments had to make, people had to make using regulation. For instance, you prioritize, should this road be for iron ore mining? Should it be for the elephants to cross? Should it be for the villagers? Should alterations of landscapes actually be allowed? So for instance, Amitabh Bachchan comes on television and gives a fantastic advertisement saying, Kach nahi dekha to kuch nahi dekha. If you've not seen Kach, you haven't seen anything. And truly, if you've not seen Kach, you might not have seen how dramatically landscapes get altered and the kind of conflicts you see. So if you see, this is what Google imagery will tell you. Google imagery will tell you on the first picture there are mud flats, intertidal areas and mangroves. The last image will tell you it's a huge Mundra port and SCZ sitting there. So that's how in Google imagery it transforms. In real time it transforms into this. An entire mudflat area which was otherwise used for camel grazing is now cordoned off and is prohibited area, almost like concentration camps. So this is what the alterations are all about. It replaces local livelihoods. We've spoken about that. That power plant is actually gradually moving towards the sea to draw water. So far as it has been stopped. So it's a constant negotiation that's taking place. But this is a problem that needs to be managed. And regulation is often considered to be an ally by the governments and policymakers, that the regulation will help you to make those trade-offs. You can decide this versus that. Often people say that, okay, I'll say yes to this, I'll say no to this, or I'll say yes, but as long as you fulfill these conditions. These kinds of things come up. So you need regulation. But there are two issues that have been, especially in today's time, where, when we've been speaking of the Anthropocene as well, there are two big challenges for regulation that come up. One is the very logic behind environment regulation in most policy documents, whether it's the World Bank pushing for certain reforms, or the offset mechanisms which we've been talking about since yesterday. The first logic is the application of the Kuznets curve, which I learned, economics is definitely not my favorite subject, but I learned this to understand why decisions are landing up the way they are. If despite all the impacts, why decisions are really landing up in approvals, etc. It made complete sense to me. For instance, it says, so when it was used for poverty reduction, it basically said as per capita income will increase, inequality will increase, and if we have enough money in our hands, we will use that to resolve the inequality crisis. Now, the same thing in environment regulation is used. When you're applying environment regulation, you assume that as per capita income and economic stature of a country is increasing, environment degradation will also increase. So Hasdeoran can be broken up, fragmented, doesn't matter, all the conflicts will arise. Once we have enough money in our hands, we become that superpower, we will be able to use that money to resolve the crisis. So most of these offsets mechanisms are really relying on those logic, whether it's net present value, whether it's compensatory afforestation, RED in the climate change regime. That is that's the logic. The problem is in this, you don't know when that curve will actually shift, because when we're talking about an aspirational economy like India, you're constantly moving up. You don't know when the tip will actually turn, the curve will actually turn. And the other is something like environment and social justice issues. By the time you come back, you're talking about replacing these areas. You're talking about recreating Hasdeoran Forests. You're talking about recreating cultures, which some people might say it's okay, it's lost. But some people would also say it's, this definitely is not on. So why decisions get taken in like thousands of clearances get issued is because it's okay. Right now, let's just go, let's just grow and become an economic superpower. We'll talk about this later. We'll recreate the environment because human beings are able to recreate the environment at a later stage. The second point I wanted to flag about regulation is that today, at least, regulation is not operating in isolation. So since yesterday, we've been talking, lots of words have come up, rights, enclosures, valuation. Almost when a crisis is actually established, different constituencies are pulling policy solutions in different ways. So you have, in a same space, people trying to create enclosures of wildlife. So that's the one way to protect it. There are tribal communities who will actually exercise that right and say, give us individual and community rights, and we will pull it in our direction, and then we'll decide what to do. And then there's lots of people in policy who will say, okay, if you increase the price of the forest to really, really high price, nobody will be able to transact it. So everybody is actually pulling it in different directions. And in between all this is this trade-off that the regulation needs to do. Whether it should be for the elephants, do they have more value? Is it the elephants' rights or the forest rights? So all this entire mess that we are talking about is very central to how both environmental groups, social justice and environmental groups, as well as governments are responding to this conflict and contestation that's taking place. And I'll just end with my second story, which is sand dunes, beetle vines, and a 10-year struggle. Basically, this is eastern part of India, which a project that has not been realized. People have been contesting it for a really long time. And the reason I'm flagging this is because even though this 10-year-old struggle might have ousted for a variety of reasons, not just the struggle, this particular land use change by a South Korean major, POSCO, what happens is once an area is demarcated for the purposes of industry, or for the purposes of a port, or for the purposes of mine, it tends to lose any other identity. It becomes this piece of land which you will constantly, somebody or the other will constantly want to alter, prioritize, change for something or the other. And that's what is happening in this space, something that exists right now. Some of these have been burnt, unfortunately, because of the conflicts. The sand dunes of the area, not too far away, the fishing practices. And there was acute conflict when it came to a contestation in this 10-year-old struggle, where it was close to violent. But this is what the situation is right now. This situation is that this wall is being built by the state government to actually secure the land for any future economic use. So basically, it is already a contested space. One company has moved out, rights are pending, and all that is happening, but the law is being used and regulation is being used to actually build a wall so that it is secured for any other company in the future to be able to use that. Because it's losing, in 10 years, this is known as the steel plant and port area. The steel plant and port area. It's tending to lose all other identities, at least in the government books. Whereas people are still wanting to use it, recreate their beetle vines, reclaim spaces. So that contestation is constantly taking place. This has again gone to court. There is a very interesting, the court judgment is very interesting. They say, pull down the wall, but you can actually secure the area with a fence. So that's the judgment that has come as of early August. So I mean, it's a constant give and take that is taking place in these spaces. And I'll end with that, and end with this last picture, which is one of Asia's largest coal mines. And when we were in this space, I didn't know what to tell these guys. They were looking back, looking ahead, and I said, please don't look back, because looking ahead, you'll probably fall into that ditch if you look back. But I think in many ways, this picture symbolizes how deep the void is in these areas. What are the kind of conditions people are living in, and it's actually a space where they've already mined, and it's a complete situation where people were not supposed to be there. I mean, this probably has been their village at one point of time, and they're standing there figuring out what a hollow my village is. Yeah, so it just symbolizes for me how acute the situations are in these places. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kanchi. Because of the changed timing, I propose that we have, after each speaker, 1 or 2 questions, and so we'll have about half an hour, 40 minutes for a full panel discussion. So in case there are a couple of questions from the audience to clarify or to ask Kanchi, this is the time to do it. Yes.
Kanchi, actually, regarding your second, this Odisha area, I just wanted to know a little bit, if possible, given the time constraint, the political dynamics in that area. How does Biju Janata Dal and parties and democratic elections impact or whatever cross current there? Because I wonder, in all these elections, 17 years of Biju Janata Dal in Odisha, they have won the election in this area. Their leaders are celebrated, loved, liked by the overall political scenario. So how does it actually interact?
This particular, I mean, in terms of the state government, they've been very much part of, so usually, I don't know if you've seen MOUs signed by state governments inviting investments. They give all kinds of promises, and the Biju Janata Dal also did that with the POSCO project. The MOU that was signed actually laid it out completely, saying that, don't worry, we'll keep the area free from all encumbrances. We will get you all approvals. So upfront, political parties, through these investments, have committed certain things. And with these kinds of, with this particular case, what happened was, for a very long time, it was being pushed both by the central government, especially the PMO, as well as the state government. Somewhere down the line, the proponent themselves lost interest because of their own financial situation. And what they were really interested in was a mine nearby. But I think what the deep nexus of state governments inviting investments in all these places and actually pushing these projects is core to the argument. I mean, that's what it is. And that's why, right, even now, when it comes to securing that land for other uses, it's okay if one South Korean company goes away. They've already, the state government has already allocated that land. It has eyes on that land for some steel industry or the other. It's already been, it's in the books for that. So I think it's very, the nexus is extremely deep.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Annapurna Garimella. Annapurna is an art historian, but also works with a design company or heads a design company, and also for a not-for-profit trust working on public libraries, public interventions in research projects and teaching.
Can you just close this side one and this? Thank you, Ravi, for a wonderful conference. And thank you, Max Mueller Bhavan, and to all of you for paying such close attention. When I was invited for this panel, I didn't see myself, I didn't know how I would contribute because I'm not an environmental activist, I'm an art historian. And so I thought about what I knew enough about to actually speak today. So in 1998, I was given a grant by the India Foundation for the Arts to study contemporary religiosities in Bangalore. And I had just moved to Bangalore 2 years before, and I began to understand that my grant was given at a time when not only real estate was booming, but also certain other factors had come into play that over the previous decade. One was the liberalization of the cement industry, as well as the transformation of engineers' status, so that the two people who went into engineering college, the IT engineer would be making like 50,000 rupees a month, whereas the civil engineer at that time was almost unemployable. So civil engineers were looking for places to enact their engineering, and they were looking at the civic conservancy areas like parks and triangles as spaces. And this, of course, colluded with the widespread desire across religions, castes, everything. It is not just Hindus, it's not just Muslims, it's not just Christians to build religious shrines in public spaces. A massive amount of research on Bangalore began to happen. Many of you in Bombay are familiar with Dilip D'Souza and Anuradha Mathur's work, but they had done a book called Deccan Traverses. And since then, there have been other books, Smriti Srinivas, James Heitzman, the late James Heitzman, Janaki Nair's work. And all of this work was kind of beginning to think about the city as something that was in transition. So I don't know that city because I just moved there. But I was fascinated by a city. I moved to Bangalore just out of sheer love. There wasn't any other reason to move there except just love. And it was just a love of a place. It was like instant. So I just moved there. And I began to live in a place that had an enormous amount of parks. If you read the latest and very important book, from which I have gained some amount of inspiration, is Harini Nagendra's new book about trees in Bangalore. It's called The City. Some people have been asking about nature in the city. Her book is called, I think, Nature in the City or something like that. So it's a beautiful book in terms of facts, and she establishes a few things. So let me take you through this journey. So I'm not going to present any necessarily the kinds of very important contestations that Kanchi did, but what I am going to present to you in this brief period is contesting imaginaries for a thing called a park, right? And that's why I called it A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, because if you were a child growing up in the United States, one of the things that you were assigned was a tree grows in Brooklyn. So for me, it's a tree grows in Bangalore. And the way that this thing imagines a social sphere and an eco-world and a relationship between human beings, governments, history, landscape, all these sort of things. So let me just quickly take you through a very broad 250 years, 1700 to 1950. So if you look at Bangalore, I'm just going to give you some views of parks. This is Robert Home in 1792 doing an etching of the east view of the Cypress Garden, which was the garden that Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan had formed at the heart of the city, which is now known as Lal Bagh. And you can see that actually, and this is corroborated by Harini Nagendra, that the landscape of Bangalore was fairly barren, except for totas, which are like small orchards, temple gardens, and then these sort of the beginnings of both aesthetic spaces and productive spaces, like the Char Bagh of Lal Bagh, right? So the Lal Bagh today is a kind of accumulation of various botanical desires and imaginings. So this is another one by 1792 by Claude Martin of the Cypress Garden, and again, very important. It kind of telescopes the big things in the city. That lone tree there is an important thing because that's how very big things were marked, was by the big tree, right? And here's another image, east view of the Cypress Garden in 1804. And this is Lal Bagh jumping very quickly to 1860 when the British take control of it. It's after 1857. This is a residency town now to the princely state of Mysore, and all sorts of new rationalizations of the space and new kind of a sort of Linnaean imaginary is also coming in, because you're bringing plants from all over the world. Many of you may know that Bangalore is somewhere between the two altitudinal extremes of India. So you can acclimatize everything in Bangalore and then shift it up or down. So that's how it works there, right? So all these pieces from all over the world were brought there, and it was reimagined partly through the lens of Kew Gardens and in dialogue with Kew Gardens, in dialogue with the botanical gardens in Calcutta and in other places across the world. And then by 1902, you have this unbelievable botanical diversity there. Like, it's just mind-boggling. So if you're someone like me who loves texture and color and shading, this is the city that you'll fall in love with. So here is this tree in Trees in Cubbon Park, another big park initiated by Mark Cubbon, which has all of these layers and layers, like a tropical forest of planting. And of course, it's diminishing, actually, from what Harini Nagendra tells us, the botanical diversity in the city, because of various planning regimes that have come into place, which de-emphasize tall trees and which de-emphasize tall exotics and emphasize locals and shrubs, which are a mixed bag, right? So another very important thing about Bangalore is that large areas which we associate with traditional Bangalore actually really came into being after the plague in 1899, when the old city had to be evacuated and new areas had to be made. And a place like Malleshwaram was actually a camp during the outbreak of the, this is where Indian Institute of Science is, if any of you are familiar, and NIAS. National Institute for Advanced Studies, just right there. So this is what it looked like according to an illustration in the Hindu. And this is what it looks like today, Margosa Road. Margosa, of course, is Neem, and in Malleshwaram now. So it's a kind of terrific transformation, a terrific reimagination of a landscape. And then, of course, if you search for Bangalore flowering trees, this is the image you get. It's like a veritable bouquet, and it's because from Krumbigel, G.H. Krumbigel, the German botanist, Marigauda, and many other botanists who planted in Bangalore, Krumbigel really wanted to do Kalidasa's Ritu Samhara in the city. So he invited the plantation, or he initiated the plantation of trees that would bloom in different colors. One would bloom, it would end, another would bloom. So you would have a continuous cycle of color and flora in the city. So it's a kind of unbelievable romance of what a landscape can do, and a kind of beautiful classical imaginary tied to a botanical science. Botanist's work. So now I want to bring you very quickly to 1950 through 1995, and this is smack dab right in the middle of both the 5-year plan regimes, but also the end of those regimes in some way, and the start of liberalization. I moved to Bangalore in 1996. So just so you get a sense of how this thing is framed. So this is a very important road in Jayanagar, Bangalore, and this is called 4th Main Road. And Jayanagar was inaugurated in some records. You can say it is 1949 if you think about one aspect of Jayanagar, but it's really 1950s that it comes up. It was Asia's largest planned layout. I think at its inception it was 25 square kilometers. And people like S.P. Neginihal were very important to its plantings. So all these trees you see here date from that period, and these are all South American rain trees that line the roads of this beautiful street. And this is another reason why I fell in love with the city. And my house, where I sat and wrote my dissertation and everything else, was on the border of this street where there's a park. So the planting was done in some ways to evoke a forest. So when it grew up, you almost on a foggy, rainy, misty Bangalore morning, you feel like you're in some other land, a kind of netherworld or a beautiful space where elves and trolls and things can walk around. And it's there. It's a sort of magical space, right? And why is it so beautifully maintained, this place, is because if you look at the Bangalore city divisions, you will see that there's southwest, that it's through this park I've just shown you, the road I've shown you on the two sides, there's this park for 2.5 kilometers. That's where the Kaveri River water pipeline enters the city from Krishnaraj Sagar Dam and into Bangalore. So it's very important to preserve that park in order to make sure that if you need to do repairs, you need to do adjustments, it's easy access. So N. Lakshman Rao, who planned this layout, made these spaces as a park. So what you see, that building right there, is the pump house for one of this is the park itself. It's planted with eucalyptus trees, rain trees, many other kinds of Singapore cherries, all different kinds of trees, but the pump house is what is saving this park, in some sense, from a kind of extreme development. But things are happening in the park. So the one thing that has been happening is the Bangalore Metro, right? So the Bangalore Metro, where you see South End Circle to Jayanagar, is where the park is. So at the southern end of the line, South End Circle to Jayanagar, that's the focus of my talk, large part of my talk. When the metro was being built, of course, it was going through an identity transformation. So the children's jungle gyms were breaking down. That's on the left is an older slide. On the right is a new fiberglass slide that's also falling apart. You can see the metro construction there. This is once it's complete, right? So this is I think it's a drone view of that metro line, and that park that you see right from there to here is the place that a chunk of the imagination of how I'm thinking about contesting imaginations is working itself out. So you see the metro station at the top of the slide. I lived across the road, across the park in a building right there. So it was a kind of like a perch on all these things that are happening there. So this is the top view, the bird's eye view, so to speak, but this is what it feels under the metro. So it still is able to hold on to kind of a poetics of some sort of sublime quality, some sort of weird dystopian beauty, something like that. I don't have words for these yet. These are just things I'm thinking about. And this is the park itself. And the things that I've marked in there, the Abhay Ganesha temple is basically founded by the BJP. The Congress Ganesha temple is the earliest temple in that area. And if you go further up in purple, I have shown you a kind of gym, cricket ground, Kaveri water pump, Janta Dal Ganesha festival ground. It functions as empty space. Above that is a mosque, which is essentially no man's land, because the park, the little square footage of park in front of it is kind of manicured, but everybody's scared to engage with that space politically because the mosque is there, right? Or maybe that is the way the politics engages it, by leaving it unengaged at some level, right? Beautified and unengaged, sorry. And then at the very top is the Cantilever Park and badminton court. It's a new thing. This is all within like a 3-minute walking distance. This is the kind of intense and plotting of the landscape that's happening. So, and that badminton court's another BJP ward president who has brought this in, MLA, sorry, at that time. And then finally, it's the clock tower, the Ambara Chumbana, the sky-kissing clock tower. So that's what it means. So it's a kind of crazy, the South End Circle was the end of Bangalore at one time. So inside this park, right in front of my house, first Ganesha emerged under a tree. So getting back to the tree. So he was self-born, a Swayambhu Ganesha, and he needed a building. So over 20 years, he started getting a building, right? So he gets fences, he gets buildings. You can see the big tree in the back. That's where he emerged. And then he's given all natural alankara, right? So time's up. Okay, I'll just end it as quickly as possible. And then a Chandavaliya Tota, which is named after a Kannada film starring Rajkumar, is put into that park for children. And this is the politician that does it, and that's the film. And then it's landscaped in a certain way for walkers. And then the metro happens, and this wrestling ground happens. And then 2 separate entrances, one for the temple, one for the park, are put side to side so that they both get their own little spaces within this park. And the park itself has a kind of very complex engagement with the village that is never there but is now being remembered in the park, and also the jungle in the park. And then finally, the tree that is divine. And now, to conclude, what is happening all over Bangalore, even in this park, is that the tree is now going from a kind of botanical specimen to something that can be productive, to something that can give shade, to something that is also divine. It is now also gaining this imaginary as an urban citizen. So for example, when the trees were cut when the metro was being built, there were protests, right? So this is all the protests. This is from Save, Don't Cut Me, giving the tree a certain kind of agency to talk through the person of the human being that is protesting. Tree is now counted in some ways as a census. This is also happening in my neighborhood in Delhi. Weird, maybe it happens wherever I go, in South Delhi. It's also happening in the way that trees are being given a certain kind of agency and asking for save me, right? And finally, there's a new kind of person emerging who is the tree doctor. And this doctor goes around saving the trees whose branches have been cut to accommodate electrical lines, Wi-Fi lines, all these different things. And they are sometimes poisoned and chopped down by people because you have to go through a lengthy permission process. So it's treated as something to be murdered. You know, it's a peculiar kind of state. And this person comes and treats it and then replants it. So I'm going to end it there. And these are the scenarios that are going on. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you. Question, please. Yeah, Darren.
You just mentioned in passing the exotic species. So I wonder how you treat them, because as you know, casuarina and eucalyptus and gulmohar pose a threat in Mumbai. People are dying of gulmohar branches falling on them. So how do you actually reconcile yourself to that?
So I think that where most of this kind of trees were planted were very wide boulevards, because it happened when the city of Bangalore was being replanned in some model of Getty's, garden city type thing. The thing is that let's say over the last 20 years, and I've watched this happen, most of these trees have become very vulnerable because of two different, one is you cement the root system, so it's kind of very unstable now. And the other thing is you cut the branches in a very instrumental way because they provide the infrastructure, which the government isn't providing, for mounting signage, mounting wiring, mounting, even the telephone department uses trees. Can you imagine? Cable wires, all these sort of things. So in a sense, in many places, they just fall and they do the kind of damage you're talking about. But in a way, it's going back to what came first? What came first? And whose imaginings are more important? So there's a real kind of struggle here. Are we the Bangalore of Kumbigal and Neginhal? Or are we the Bangalore that needs connectivity and doesn't need to think about it, needs to be instant? We don't need to ask the cable guy, can you please think about where you're hanging your wire? I mean, it's everywhere. So it is a problem. There's no doubt about it. So that's why, for example, the corporation, when it's doing new planning, is saying that we're not going to use these big trees from elsewhere. We're going to do honge, which is a kind of local oil tree, medicinal, or we'll do like bushes, like everything's at the airport, right? Yeah, no birds, no height. But you lose a poetics of space, and that's what people are saying when they protest, is that we need our elders. There is something of that in there. We need our elders around. And these trees are our elders. I really think this question of exotics and native trees is being reframed very profoundly over the last decade. Because if something's around long enough, it becomes worship. It becomes yours. So for example, Ganda Fool is not native to India, but now it's part of our ceremonies, right? So this is the kind of interesting thing.
Thank you.
Sir.
Just one short question, because I have to carry
Sure.
on. Thank you.
India's population, I think, has doubled or tripled since 1950. How do you see the interaction between
the pressures of population, the imperatives of development, and the aesthetics of development. Which is, I believe that aesthetics and the larger story is very important. There are also competing pressures. How do you see these three interacting and playing out in the future?
Actually, that's a perfect question for the larger panel, because if you might hold on to it, because you can certainly pose it. I'll give you the first question for the larger panel.